My name is Lily Landakusik, and this is Voices of Hope. And our mission is to help spread awareness and prevention information, resources, and tools for parents and professionals about any form of trauma, abuse, or injustice. And today's topic is about our training series on parental alienation prevention. And I'm privileged to have here Rael Lapenta, and she is going to co-host a series with me on parental alienation prevention resources. And she has been, I would introduce you as a national advocate for victims, and her impact in spreading awareness about alienation, stopping misinformation, and then really connecting professionals and parents to tools has been really significant. And it's just such a pleasure, Rael, to be able to talk about this topic, because so many of the people we've been working with are really grateful and almost shocked that there are resources and feeling helpless, desperate. And so I wanted to introduce a little bit about your organizations and let you talk a little bit about how you got into this, and then jump right in on this first topic of what is the difference between the criminal versus the civil. And then later we can talk more about some of the other topics that we will branch off into about misinformation, some of the controversies with cadence law and how that can hurt protections of alienation, and how shared parenting and that movement, which you've been such a huge part of, is really helping change like underlying paradigms, underlying belief systems about, you know, how to completely prevent this divide and this area of litigation and shift completely toward prevention. So with that, I want to introduce you, Rael, and tell us a little bit about you, and then break off into this first topic of how to use criminal and understand how to couple it with the civil court and the family law that everyone's probably most familiar and probably most frustrated with.
Yes, it's true. Thank you so much, Lily, for having me. It's always a pleasure working with you. My name is Rael Lapenta. I'm in Pennsylvania, and I work with Claudio Valles through Pennsylvania, or not through Pennsylvania, I'm sorry, through Interference with Child Custody Coalition, or IC3, which you can find on Facebook at facebook.com/enforceicc. And the website is heroesforchildrensrights.org. And we basically work on just helping parents understand that they have rights, and to help them advocate for their rights in a situation where your custody is being interfered with, because this is a criminal offense. It's a law in every state. It's a felony in most states, and has been for 40 and 50 years. It's been on the books, although unfortunately it's not a well-known law, so it's not always enforced. There are ways to get this enforced, and that's what we help parents understand and learn how to do.
And I want to ask, how did you start to find out that people aren't aware of some of this information? How did you start to become aware that there was a really big gap for victims?
In my own personal case, I had separated from my ex, and we were trying to share custody of our 3 kids. And I was first exposed to the court system in 2020. And it just didn't feel like things were going right. I just didn't understand what was happening in my case. I didn't understand. I thought that when you went to court and when you went to the police, that they would help you. And that wasn't happening in my case. So I just started searching and searching. And I came across Dr. Petra Dieter, actually, and we did a awareness day. And I started working with her on cadence law. Went last session, and then she had connected me with Claudio Valles, who's doing, amazing work, and we started working together. Just we work on cadence law in many states. We work on advocacy and legislation for custodial interference laws, and we work on educating parents and for advocacy.
And it's so detailed what you do, like with cadence law. And before we break into maybe the topic of the civil versus criminal in family law issues or crimes, and how to protect and enforce, but could you talk about cadence law and some of the controversies, so that any information from people who might be misunderstanding how that is helpful, but how it can also be misconstrued and used abusively or criminally to hurt alienated victims?
Absolutely. Caden Mancuso is a case that happened in Pennsylvania in Bucks County. It was a situation where her mother tried to enforce custodial interference, which is a law in Pennsylvania. The criminal code is 2904, interference with child custody. And she tried to get the police to enforce it. They would not enforce it. And Caden Mancuso was wound up being murdered by her father. So that case wound up becoming a federal law. It inspired a federal law under VAWA, which is Violence Against Women Act. And although the intentions of that law is to keep children safe, it explicitly leaves out psychological abuse. And it only addresses situations where there's physical abuse and sexual abuse. And as we all know, all types of abuse are just as damaging for children. So in each state, there is a big incentive financially under the VAWA Act for each state to pass a law. And although some pieces of this law seem like they'll fix things in family court, if you are alienated or if there is psychological abuse, this law, if it's passed in your state, will significantly harm your case.
Do people understand that? Because so many times I'm meeting people who really feel like Cadence Law is the answer and maybe don't understand that it needs to have protective wording, just like a court order, just like a court order, even an example would be a falsified protective order, that the concept of the protective order makes so much sense. Everybody would understand, you're at risk, but no one would really think, oh, wow, if a criminal used that skill in a crime and falsified it and not being able to protect with that with Cadence Law. And if you could talk a little bit about that to help people understand the difference between the protections that it is designed for, but the gaps that leave it open
Do
for
some
abuse.
specific examples. So in every state last session, they used the name of a child that was murdered by an abusive father. Now, we all know that it doesn't really matter with gender in terms of domestic violence. It happens to both men and women, but each state picked one child that was murdered by a father, and there was a protective mother. And so then Caden's Law claims to keep children safe. That's called the Keeping Children Safe Act. But some of the legislation, so in each state, it's different. For example, in Colorado, it goes into if you have a strained relationship with your child and you're in custody court, that you must, so if you were a targeted parent or you're the parent that's having an issue with your child for whatever reason, either you're alienated, maybe there's something like reactive attachment disorder, there could be plenty of issues, but they're saying that that parent must accept responsibility and then has to go to meaningful therapy and has to have someone monitor their behavior before the family court can make any kind of ruling in custody or look at the other parent that has the child primarily, either by court order or from just retaining them. In other states, they have said things like, if you are alleged to abuse someone, abuse a child or domestic violence, that then the family courts would be prohibited from giving you custody of your child, even if you were found not guilty in a court of law or in CYS. So those are just two of the strongest examples. It also is saying that reunification therapy is not allowed. And although there is controversy over some uses of it, that's a treatment that's used for many, many different reasons. And even if one person is abusing that right and privilege, it doesn't mean that you take that tool away from parents and families that need it for so many reasons.
I know the part that you're talking about was some of the gaps. If a parent wanted to use Cadence Law manipulatively, could they supersede and start to research some of these changes in the law and kind of get the falsified narrative bias in, that has been researched that is so damaging, because a lot of times, even when it's corrected or a crime is corrected, that they still allow the benefits of taking the child, withholding the child, sometimes unilateral custody off of falsified allegations that are never really corrected. And do people understand that with Cadence Law? I just would think in my heart that the proponents of that understand a child needs to be safe and supervised from an unsafe parent can see that if they didn't have the child, say they have the child and they're protecting the child, but if their circumstance is the child's been abducted, that law is going to prevent them from getting their child back. And I don't know if they understand that.
Yeah, no, it opens the door for allegations. I think the general consensus is that people really wouldn't stoop to that level. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. If it's something legitimate or their own trauma that a parent has gone through and they have their own issues, they do turn on the other parent, and that happens in cases. And I don't think people realize how often another parent would falsely accuse a parent of abuse. And if this law was passed, luckily in each state, it hasn't been able to go through yet, unless it had the significant changes to protect from these things. But if it is to go through, false allegations would skyrocket, because it sets it up for any kind of allegation to not have to go the route that it's supposed to go, which is through CYS and the police. Or even it could go through that route, it wouldn't matter. You could be found unfounded, it could be unsubstantiated, and you would still have these consequences in family court.
Wow. And in some of the discussions you're having with legislators, are they aware of that this can kind of put really a blank check for abuse with no regulation or protections after the falsified allegation has been made? It almost sounds like it's game over, like a death sentence almost for some of these cases. Probably some of them that have been dealing with falsified allegations through the divorce, the finances, the real estate, maybe through affairs, communications fraud, all of these not being stopped. And then we're acting surprised as professionals in the industry that, oh, now they're manipulating the kids. And, now we've got allegations of abuse, but in court world, those allegations really can win. And so how would you recommend people stand up against falsified allegations, against laws that support them? How could parents and professionals support your movement?
So when we talk to legislators, they're not really aware. They don't see those points because they see the protective pieces that can be helpful. And something like psychological abuse in California, for example, 9% of the children there are psychologically abused. 7% are physically abused, and 5% are sexually abused. But when you see a law that's preventing physical and sexual abuse, even though just one example is California, that state has more children that are psychologically abused, it is totally left out of the law. I think that there's just not an awareness. There seems to be a misconception that it's too hard to prove and you can't figure it out and no one knows. So it's just sort of ignored.
I want to ask you now about this topic that you are such an expert on, with the civil versus the criminal law. So I'm really excited about, asking what your feedback is about crimes that are committed in family law cases and parents not being informed, even sometimes professionals, law enforcement, CPS or DCFS workers, school officials are not being informed about the crime, custodial interference, slander, abduction, these laws that are in place. What would you recommend on sharing resources for parents to educate that those are crimes that are reportable, preventable, and can have consequences, and that in my opinion, there's this movement to kind of just say, oh, go to family court. We'll hear that from law enforcement, school, even when it's a case that could have a potential abduction. So we'll keep the kid here. We'll keep everything going the way it is. And then the victim sometimes can go years and never get justice. So I want to ask your expertise on the criminal law system versus civil law in family law cases where crimes are being committed and parents and professionals aren't aware of some of the resources that you're teaching about.
Mm-hmm. So I'm definitely not a lawyer. I'll put that out there, and I'm not giving legal advice, but I do know the information that has been out there for custodial interference. This is all public knowledge. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had put out a definition about custodial interference in 2011. And so it says family abduction occurs when, in violation of a court order, a decree, or other legitimate custodial rights, a member of the child's family or someone acting on behalf of a family member takes or fails to return a child. This is also referred to as parental kidnapping and custodial interference. So in the 70s and 80s, every state passed a law saying that custodial interference is illegal. And in most states, they say it's a felony. The police are under the misconception that it is a civil matter. Policies and procedures have to be created for police to follow through. And I think that the education just hasn't been there. In your own state, you can find out the numbers of people that have been sentenced to this crime. You can find out the background of the law. You can find out how many people are arrested for this law. But there is a difference between civil and criminal, and it's purposely, the laws were created to go the criminal route. So you have to go both routes. When you're having an issue with custody, you do have to go to family court, which then you would need a lawyer. And then you go and you present your case, and it's you against the other parent, and you're both in a dispute, and the judge will make a determination and give you a custody order. Past that, the reason that the law was created, the intent of the law was to say, if a parent is continuing to interfere with a court order, then that's when the police can get involved. And each state is written differently. So you have to read your law to make sure explicitly what it says. But in a criminal case, for example, is if your car is stolen and you call the police, and the police come out and they investigate, they give you an offense report, and you are a victim of a crime. In a lot of times what we see is that the police come out and say, oh, this is a civil matter. They might give you an incident report, and they don't investigate any further. But when a crime is committed, the police are supposed to investigate and get the evidence and bring it to the district attorney, who's then supposed to prosecute that. And as a victim of a crime, you're not the one that needs a lawyer. You're not the one that has to go and put your case on. That then becomes the state's responsibility. A lot of times they feel like they're not lawyers, they can't interpret a court order, but there have been publications from the Department of Justice that have been published back in, again, 2004, 2011. There was a lot of information published from the Department of Justice saying, you don't have to interpret a court order. All you have to say is who's supposed to have the child right now, and do they have the child right now? And that's the bottom line. And so we're really pushing parents to know your rights, know the laws, and advocate for your rights, and ask questions, respectfully, obviously, of authority. Why does it say it's a law and you won't enforce it? Why can't I report a crime as a victim? And just, know what you're supposed to be entitled to, and then make sure that you're pushing for that.
I really appreciate the accuracy of the information. When you talk about how these laws came out earlier, I'm guessing that they came out because of interference with custody, and lawmakers, people like you, realizing the domino effect that was having on family relationships, broken family manipulations. Once that perjury or ability to just lie, then justice has no truth, and without truth, there's no justice. So I feel like you're bringing back this information to tell people you have a right to be protected from harm, from falsified allegations that lead to someone blocking access of your child, and that there's a way. If you have safety issues, that's probably the biggest counter is, I have safety issues, I don't believe they're safe. I have the right to just make that determination on my own. And I don't know that I've ever seen a parent in all the cases that we've done over the last 20 years that has done that in a proactive way. Like, I want to get help. Those parents usually work it out. I see that, my co-parent has addictions issues or mental health issues, or comes from a family of trauma, and we need to treat that. And so they get professional help. But we're talking about cases where someone decides to commit a crime, and that the family law system is letting down victims on the resources that you're giving. So I want to talk now about, how would you start with a step-by-step guide for parents who might be realizing they are at the early stages of alienation? Maybe they've had a divorce that was high conflict. Maybe they had a divorce that had false accounts or affairs, lies, double life kind of stories, where one parent might be waking up to not just issues with their children, but in every aspect of working with someone in a trustful way. And if they start to see lies, and you would notice where they may not, that turns into a crime. What is the line where it becomes a reportable crime, and how to explain that to an officer who might say, we're just trained to refer you to family court?
So the first thing that we always tell parents to do is request the policy and procedural manual from your police department regarding the law in your state. So that's helpful to have, especially if it doesn't happen, then you can file an internal affairs report saying that they didn't do their job. But that specifically tells them what they're supposed to do. And then you can say, well, how come you didn't do what you're supposed to do? But, before you get that kind of thing that you can request through the Open Records Request Act, that you can then you follow your court order to a T. So you find out what is the law enforcement agency that has jurisdiction over your exchange point. So for example, if your court order says you go to McDonald's at 6 o'clock on Monday and pick up your child, then you go to McDonald's 6 o'clock Monday, you go with your court order, get a certified copy if possible from the courthouse prior, go with a witness if you can, record it. That's helpful to have that. If the police has a body cam, ask them to turn it on. And then you want to call, when you call 911 from that location, you want to report a violation saying that you are reporting a crime. So you don't want to accept a report over the phone. A police officer has to come out to the scene of a crime. And when a police officer comes out, then they can witness the crime. Which makes a difference too in terms of prosecuting it. So be sure not to deviate from your orders. Have your court order in your hand, highlighted. Today's Monday at 6 o'clock. This is my time. Cite the law. So know the penal code in your state. For example, in Pennsylvania, the penal code is 2904. In Texas, it's 25.03. So every state has a different number that makes it a crime, and know what that law says. And then if they say it's a civil matter, that's all you can do is cite the law. But I'm referring to 2904, interference with child custody, which says, and have a printout of the law. So it's important too, there's a lot of pieces of this puzzle. You do have to go the family court route. You have to do things like contempt and get the order changed in there. And then also take care of yourself. You have to deal with your own trauma, because you have to prepare yourself in advance that you are likely going to leave the scene without your child. But if you get into hysterics and upset and frustrated and you're disrespectful to the police, that's not going to help get you anywhere. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong, and it's totally understandable. It doesn't make sense, and it's frustrating, and you're concerned, and it's unfair. So leaving all the kinds of court drama and emotions out of the conversation as possible, and stick to the facts of this is Monday at 6, and this is where I'm supposed to be, and this is against the law, and we have a court order. So be sure to get the officer's name and badge number and their supervising officer. If you're denied, request a report number of the report that's going to be written up, and do not leave without a documentation of the police information, their name, how you'll get their report. A lot of times law enforcement deems these issues civil, but they're unaware that a penal code even exists. If needed, you can always elevate it and request to speak to a supervisor and see if they can help you. And then you can always request the policy and procedural manual and file an internal affairs report if you're denied to report that crime.
That is such helpful information. And I think I'm going to try to put it together, because you're so, you're a library of it all, and taking it all in for parents might feel like, where do I start? How did she organize all that? But I think the message really is that you have rights. And just because the system may be, I would say failing, I would say these cases should be transparent. They should be immediate. Parents should have resources that help them resolve disputes immediately within 24 hours, that they're expected to come up with a collaborative plan. And then if it fails, that they're expected to get resources, but that they never go on a month, let alone a year, or 5 years. So your tool, I feel like, is really a breath of fresh air for victims, and being able to trust that they have rights and that they have a right to be protected from harm in the United States, and that part of the parental rights overlap with their constitutional rights. So you're bringing in information, I think, that helps the hysteria, that point that's so important about parents getting emotional, getting into PTSD, getting hysterical, making phone calls, threats, just desperate, having a physiological, reaction to being blocked from a child. And sometimes it's suddenly, going to a drop off or pickup and your child's not there. And the people on the outside say, just go to court. Well, think about that. Think about if a parent anywhere in the United States went to pick up a child and they weren't there, that you're bringing in messaging that says that's a crime. When you're a healthy parent with the right to your child, you have the right to be protected from your child being taken. And I just want to thank you for this. This is going to be the first of the series to talk to you a lot more about the steps. I'll try to create more lists and worksheets for anybody watching out there. And if anybody wants to ask us questions or questions for Rael, I just feel like you bring in resources at a grassroots, makes me want to cry. I'm going to just be really vulnerable here and say, I'm a professional. I've dedicated my career to serving the most vulnerable populations with children and families. I grew up in one of those populations, and I started seeing these cases and started to dedicate part of my agency and career to it. And then I found myself like you, and you bring in tools that I feel like could completely take cases from horrific kind of peaks where it's almost irreparable to grassroots interventions, early intervention, the first time that there's custodial interference, a crime, falsified. Go on and look at your state laws. Find out where they lock. Don't just allow someone to say, no, you can't do anything about that. That's happened to all of us parents. Mm-hmm. And we've seen what happens when you say, no, I can do. And there are people, and there is advocacy and information. And I just want to thank you for that and highlight some of the trainings that we're going to do later if people want to keep watching you. And if you would say a little bit more about your website and Claudia, and so people can find you and any resources that they'd be able to locate and support your discussion groups, the legislative work that you did in Colorado, the work you're doing in Texas and Florida. I mean, you are really a remarkable woman, mother, parent, advocate, and you kind of carry light around you that illuminates for people. So I just want to keep spotlighting that for victims that were like me, and hopefully we can catch them early and change a paradigm here.
Yeah, thank you very much for all that. We found a system that worked, and I was lucky enough to fall into it, and we just pushed that in other states. So we help other states if they want to get involved in legislation. We're more than happy. That's what we want to do is sort of hold your hand in the beginning. It can be intimidating. I was not over a year ago. I would have never, guessed that I would ever be doing something like this. I wasn't involved in politics. I didn't understand it. It seemed like a totally different world, and it's really not as tricky as you think. And legislators do listen. So we do help you get through these steps. We do a lot of workshops, free workshops, and discussions where we help parents on via Zoom, through our Facebook page, through Interference with Child Custody Coalition, IC3. Right now, we're heavy into legislating because the session is now. So we're having multiple meetings per day in different states with legislators. So we're not doing as many workshops right now, but usually we do them almost on a weekly basis. But anybody can reach out on our page. We post information all the time, and we want to help parents get involved. Also on the heroesforchildrensrights.org, we put a section of interference with child custody under the Awareness Day from April 8th. And there has just a couple bullet points, ways to contact your legislators, and everybody's custodial interference penal codes for every state.
Well, we will follow up again and talk about the specifics that you have for people to stand up with protections needed with Caden's law, misinformation, more on different other laws that you're aware of, not just custodial interference, but if there's kidnapping, abduction, slander, defamation, falsified communication. One that I've seen also is pattern of intent to cause criminal harm. So some of these cases, I think the criminal piece that you're bringing up is central. How could we treat victims of crimes without stopping the crime? How could we, ever imagine, victims of really severe tragedies and traumas, sometimes over years, multi-generational, would come without any protection of it happening or even stopping. And I feel like that's what you're showing, is that, victims and crimes need to be protected. And that's what those laws are for. And so I'm really excited about continuing this training with you, Rael. And I'm really impressed and want to thank you for your service work for all people who are going through this, whether they're at the crisis level, whether they're an adult alienated child who's just realizing that and learning about some of your information, or whether they're, just starting to ask questions and notice signs and symptoms. I feel like your piece of the puzzle is missing and desperately needed. So I'm looking forward to the other topics, and anything you want to close so people again can support what you're doing. If there's anything right now on legislation that you could really use people to step up and know where to call or where to start to stand up for what you're doing.
Yeah, it's important, and everybody stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm entitled to this and it's not happening. Someone needs to know about it, speak out with that. And until people start advocating more often, this isn't going to end, because there's no reason not to just keep a child, because there's no consequences. But there should be consequences. And until everyone starts insisting that happens, it's not going to change. So we are seeing a change already, but the more people that know and say something, the more it's going to be enforced, and the better it will be for everybody, especially the kids.
Well, thank you so much. We'll look forward to the next one, and we'll be diving in again to the next step on the whole, on the whole picture and how people can start to make a change together. Thank you so much. So grateful.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah.